Welcome to Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and here today with another new guest and who's got a bit of a unique name, and that is Scared Sheep. How you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. So before we get started with today's movie, why don't you tell the people a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am Scared Sheep. I have a YouTube channel where I delve into more of the lesser known and harder to find Japanese horror movies and TV shows. And I not only discuss the plot points and explain the story, but I also like to go over things that people who are outside of Japan and maybe don't have as much experience with Japan and the Japanese language, things they might miss or not necessarily have a background in. So I bring those to the table as well to help give a better and deeper understanding of the movie and, make it a little bit more enjoyable from a Japanese perspective.
Okay, very cool. So let's talk a little bit about your Japanese experience then. Your accent doesn't sound like a Japanese native Japanese person. So tell me a little bit about your relationship to Japan, because I know you said you're in Japan, correct?
I am in Japan. I've lived here for nearly 10 years. And I've spent pretty much my whole adult life here, my career here, just living the life. I have family here. I am married to a Japanese man. And so a lot of interesting perspectives, I think, that I can bring to the table as somebody who came from outside the culture and is now very ingratiated into it.
Yeah, very, very similar experiences myself, although I'm guessing your Japanese is probably a lot better than mine.
I do try to improve upon it daily, but yeah, it's a work in progress.
It is, yeah. You have that really sharp increase right at the beginning stages, and then after that it just kind of plateaus. But I've started taking I started taking classes now, so I'm trying to put in the effort a little bit more. It's That's tough great. When you work in a place where it was easier when I used to work in regular public schools because nobody spoke English there. But at all the schools I work at now, like everybody speaks English, so it makes it a lot harder.
Yeah, it's hard. It can be difficult to find opportunities outside of just going to the shops.
Yeah. That's one of the things that surprises people when I tell them you actually don't have a whole lot of opportunities to speak unless you're encountering it daily. Mm-hmm. And so how did you get interested in Japanese horror films?
Well, I have always been interested in horror ever since I was a child. It was one of the things that for as long as I can remember was a topic of interest to me. Growing up, I watched Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark and all of those 90s TV shows that I could get my hands on. And then around, I guess, high school, I started seeing a lot more Japanese movies becoming available, and way back when, Blockbuster was a thing. And renting those and thinking, wow, these are really cool and unique. I've never seen anything like this. And then once the internet kind of became more of what it is today, trying to find more of those. And now living in Japan, we still have video rental stores here.
Yes,
so we can, actually just peruse the aisles like I used to. And there's a ton that I realized I'd never seen before, even though I have been watching horror and Japanese horror for so many years. It's like, hey, these actually aren't available outside of Japan. And so I've just, constantly been watching those. And I also like horror video games. So a lot of my life is horror related.
Yeah, I had that we have a Tsutaya right walking distance from us, and
nice.
And yeah, it's like I love the streaming services, but there is something lost to just browsing the aisles like we used to do back in the day.
Oh, absolutely.
And something else you mentioned there. I think we had very, very similar trajectories because you're talking about the 90s. I'm guessing we're probably around the same generation or so. And very similar experiences, getting into the J horror wave. And one of the things I noticed since doing this podcast is a lot of the movies that we talk about that were once available back when I was still in the States are now out of print and they're not available anymore. So it becomes a lot harder to find those things for a lot of people. I found that a lot of people have to, kind of dig around to find like Hong Kong dubs or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. And then when you do find them, they're not necessarily the best quality.
Yeah.
Or, even the DVD itself is just, it's hard to find.
Yeah. They need to get better distribution on streaming services. I know Netflix is doing a lot more work with Japanese film companies these days, but I mean, there's still a lot of stuff out there that nobody's really touching and nobody's really talking about.
And I find too, a lot of the streaming services, especially with Netflix having like this huge budget, they're producing a lot of new movies, but nobody is kind of going back a lot of the time and featuring a lot of the films outside of like the typical The Ring or Ju-on or those kinds, the ones that everybody knows.
Yeah. And it's kind of surprising with some of the name, like, they have a deal with Shion Sono, but they're not really releasing any of his older films on the service, at least as far as I've seen.
Yeah, it would be really great to see them kind of go back, and even if they're just going through the popular directors, and showing some of their lesser known films. That would be really great to see as well.
Yeah, I'd love to see more of that stuff. Anyway, that's a little bit of a transition into the J horror movie we're going to be talking about today, and it's Hideo Nakata's Dark Water from 2002. And this was one of those movies that kind of came out in the wave that was started with Ring and then Ju-on. And just like those ones, it got a pretty popular, or pretty, maybe not so much popular, but pretty well-received reception in the West. Wasn't like Ring levels of popularity. But, and then it also spawned an American remake starring Jennifer Connelly. What was your first exposure to this movie?
So my first exposure was actually just finding the Japanese original, just out of, pure like scrolling through, seeing what was available. And the cover art that they showed next to the little description really intrigued me. And then I read about it and I was like, okay, let's give this a shot. And I really enjoyed it in a different way than I think I enjoyed The Ring, because I feel like this one, just for me at least, was a little bit more emotional, especially the ending. I won't get into it, but I did find the ending really kind of touched me a little bit. And then in addition, it is a ghost story at its heart, which I have always enjoyed. But yeah, I originally watched that one out of just coincidence, and then I realized, oh, there's an American remake. Watched that one, and I was like, oh, I'm just gonna stick with the Japanese one.
Yeah, I never saw the American remake, but this was one of the ones that after you watch Ring and you ask people about what are the other ones, Dark Water, it's like the trilogy of the J horror of the early 2000s. It was Ring, Ju-on, and Dark Water. And I'd watched Ring, loved it, watched Ju-on, liked that pretty well, and then saw Dark Water, and like you, it hit me in a different way than those other two did, because I'd watched it with my best friend, and after it was over, we're just kind of sitting there and we're like, yeah, that was good. It wasn't really, but instead of scary, we're just like, it's just more sad than anything else, like the story.
It really is.
Yeah. And it was much more emotional than I was really expecting. It was I felt like the horror aspect of it was really minimal compared to some of the other J horror movies.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a movie that I would say is scary. Certainly it's not something that I think even people who are usually scared would be scared by it necessarily. It has a couple moments, but it's almost a lot more atmospheric in the tone, and it's very rainy and wet all the time, and it's kind of heavy in that way. And then there are, moments of when you see the ghost and when you're dealing with her, and it's like almost a worried feeling rather than a scared feeling.
Yeah.
Because at least for me, I definitely did develop a kind of bond and caringness with the characters, with the mother and daughter. And I did want to see them get the happy ending. But yeah, to say you end up getting scared. I mean, I'm sure there's some people who, do find that sort of thing scary, or maybe are a little bit more easily scared. But when you've seen so many of these movies, sometimes you do end up being a little bit, I guess, desensitized to it. But certainly, I still wouldn't say this is a scary movie, but rather it's a sad ghost story.
Yeah, I think there might be some cultural aspects to that, because when I first saw it, like I said, it was a good story. It was sad, but then I didn't really see it again until a few years ago, in fact. So there's like a span of 15 years where I hadn't seen this movie, and then I had watched it. And my wife and I were looking for something to watch, and she loves horror movies. You and her probably get along really well. But she loves horror movies, and she loves ghost stories. She's not so big on grotesque stuff, but anything, you got a ghost story, she's there. And so we're looking through the list of movies I have, and we came across Dark Water, and she said, "Okay, let's watch that." So, and then we watched it, and it had hit me a different way than it did after being in Japan for so many years, which I'll get to. But with her, she's someone who believes in ghosts. We're house hunting now, and whenever we find a place that's that's big and cheap, she's always like, "Oh no, somebody died there. There's a ghost there." Last night I was rewatching it, and she walks into the room. She's like, "Oh no, quiet," and then she walked out.
There is actually a website, I don't know if you know of this, where you can check to see if anybody has died in an apartment.
Oh no, don't. I know, but I'm purposely not telling her about that, because
just in case you are legitimately worried about that. But
no. In fact, whenever she tells that, I say good. Then that means they'll knock down the rent.
Yeah, I definitely feel that after moving to Japan, Japanese movies and horror movies hit a little different. Just because so many of them, I think they're very, not just set in a very Japanese setting, but they're intrinsically Japanese.
Right.
And so especially when you have, movies, let's take Ju-on, for instance, where it's all pretty much set in a house, in a very Japanese house, and then you live in a very Japanese house, and you're like, that closet looks an awful lot like mine. It does tend to, I think, just bump up that fear factor just a little bit with the familiarity. When you're watching it in a setting that looks nothing like it, and you're like, well, that ghost would have no place to be. And then you're watching it in a place where it's very similar, it does hit a bit different.
Absolutely, yeah. This one especially hit very different, because I hadn't really paid much attention to it the first time around. But after living here, after knowing some single mothers, after reading about the stories about things that single mothers go through here, the whole movie took on a whole new resonance for me, with the whole idea of Yoshimi being a single mother and struggling in the society. And the movie says a lot about the way Japanese society treats single mothers.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And obviously the whole metaphor of drowning, it makes so much sense when you look at it in that context, right? She's just, trying to get back into work after being out of it for 6 years. She's struggling to make a home for her daughter. And, the best place she can afford is this, rundown old building, and struggling with, having to get to the kindergarten on time to pick up her daughter. And I mean, that's stuff that so many, single mothers here struggle with. And I'd read a study, this is a few years ago, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but there was not a study, it was an article saying that single mothers are like the biggest at-risk group for poverty in Japan.
Yeah, I have a fuzzy memory of hearing something similar, and it wouldn't surprise me. The system's just not set up the way it is in a lot of like Western countries,
Right.
with support.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, Yochien and Hoikuen, like nursery school and kindergarten, are fortunately fairly plentiful and not, at least the public ones, not very expensive.
Right.
But at the same time, a lot of the system itself is not set up to support single mothers. It's set up to support that sort of typical nuclear family. And especially where in Japan, the majority of mothers do not work.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the timings, most kindergarten and nursery schools, I think from the age of about 3, the kids get out around 2:30. And I mean, what full-time job, do you only work until then? Not only until then, but you have to actually get out earlier to be on time to pick them up.
Right. Yeah.
And then if you want them to stay later, you need to pay more.
Especially in an area where if you don't have, because I don't think people in America and possibly Canada too don't realize that having a car in Japan is actually pretty expensive, with when you have the inspection fees and the insurance and the tax on it. And if you're a single mother struggling to make ends meet, chances are, unless you're living in a rural area, you probably don't have a car either. So that adds even more time to the commute to get to the kindergarten.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, not only do people living in the larger cities, which has the majority of the Japanese population in them, the majority of them do not have a car, but then, like, God forbid, bad weather. I mean, let's see, anytime it snows in Tokyo, that just completely messes up the train system. Right. If you have, earthquakes or any sort of accidents, then you've got delayed trains, you've got any other issues where, let's say, you miss your train if you're in an area where it doesn't run as frequently. Like, there's all kinds of things that could end up, causing someone to be late to pick up their kid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they show that aspect really well in this movie, and just like all the things she's struggling with. And there's also this judgmental aspect too, the societal judgment they put on working mothers, basically, where, and you kind of see this in that opening scene with when Yoshimi's a child and her mother's going through the same thing. And we don't know so much about what her situation was with her mother. We only get some kind of hints, like her aunt says, like, oh, your mother only cared about herself and all that. But even still, I'm not so sure if we can necessarily judge her mother too harshly, because we don't know what that situation was, because there's a lot of cases where a lot of other women, even in Japanese society, will judge women who work, and it's like, oh, look, you don't care enough about your kids to take off work early, or you don't care enough about your kids to to be a stay-at-home mom. And there's that kind of judgmental aspect to it a lot of the times.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think for Yoshimi's case, it does seem like it was a bit of on an extreme end, that her mom ended up just kind of leaving her to her aunt.
Right.
But absolutely, for working moms in Japan, especially, like, if your kid gets a fever, like, they have to go home. And especially, I think nowadays the rules are even more strict with COVID, but they can't come back the next day. And it's to the point where there are even like daycares specifically for sick kids. So parents, can go to work. It's frowned upon to leave early and take all these sick days. People don't want to have the extra work put on them, or parents feel guilty for putting extra work on coworkers. So that kind of doubles the aspect of making it difficult to take time off. I mean, this is a society where people don't use their vacation days. Right.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And that's something that when people talk about Japan having things like maternity leave and all that, which is true, we do. Like, my wife's currently on maternity leave now, and she gets, basically 2 years. But the thing is, you have to be working in a full-time position or working for a big enough company to get that, and B, you have to actually ask for it, and there's a lot of pressure on people not to take their vacation time, not to take their paid leave, and there's always this kind of pressure. It's like, oh, yeah, you could take the time, but it's going to put a lot of pressure on your coworkers and all this, and there's a lot of that soft, passive aggressive type of pressure on people not to take time off.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is still, I would say your wife is even maybe not necessarily the norm situation. This is still a society where a lot of women, when they get married, they're expected to quit.
Yeah, exactly.
Because then they're going to go home and, have family and be stay-at-home mom. So even though the maternity leave is great, it's still not quite there in terms of the support.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. She's definitely an outlier in that. I've read so many stories about how as soon as a woman gets married, everyone at her job is always asked, so when are you gonna have a baby? When are you gonna have a baby? And then as soon as they have a baby, it's like, oh, so you're pregnant now. Well, you're going to be quitting when you have the baby, right? And then we're gonna have to find someone else to take your spot. And there's all that pressure on them to not just take maternity leave, but just to flat out quit.
Which is so funny because, you would think the support would be there when you look around and see all of these things for children. Japan is a very child-friendly country. I mean, you go to the mall or the shopping center and there's all of these places for kids to either play or, the nursing rooms and the diaper changing rooms. They're great facilities, like super clean. And there's so much that's available to support the children, but then the support for the parents, the support for the mothers just isn't there. And it's kind of weird.
It is weird. It's when I tell people about the support system for children here, and it's so one-sided because there are those positive aspects, like all those facilities that are great, taken advantage of many times myself, my daughter, and then there's subsidies, right? The government gives out, cash subsidies on a, quarterly basis or something like that. And however it is for like every child you have, tax breaks, kindergarten's basically free for public schools from like the age of 3, or the age of 2, I think it is actually, whatever. But whatever the case is, they have all this support system. We have also like, we don't live in a big metropolitan area, but we live in like a small suburban area. And there's this local daycare center where we can go and we can have them watch my daughter for, 500 yen an hour. And so that was perfect. Like just last week we used that, and it was 1,500 yen. She got to stay there for 3 hours. She got to play with the toys. And because of COVID, nobody else was there. So like all the staff was like fawning over her, and she didn't want to leave when I came to pick her up. And it was perfect. But the other side to that is, like you were saying, they're just, women aren't getting the support they need. Even men aren't getting the support they need for paternity leave. It exists here, but it's still very, very frowned upon.
Yeah, it's almost non-existent to the point where, nobody takes it. Like, yes, it is there, but the cut in the pay, the amount of time, I don't know anybody actually who's taken the paternity leave. I know people who take their paid time off instead. But to say they took like the actual government mandated paternity leave, it's almost unheard of.
Yeah, there was one case a few years ago where there was a German guy who was living in Japan. He took paternity leave and he got fired, and then he ended up suing it, and he ended up suing his company because of that. I'm not sure what the outcome of that case was, or if it's even been resolved yet, but that was at least that was probably the most high profile case I've heard of, and I personally don't know anybody who's done it.
No, it's you're almost expected not to take it, because why would you? The wife is there, right? It's exactly. Still a very patriarchal, gender rolled society.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why they're having the population problems they're having right now.
I mean, if you want to fix that, I would start supporting mothers a lot more.
Exactly.
Not only like to support them as mothers, but support them as working mothers.
Yeah. And there's just such a dearth of that here, and also just the way that she's treated in the divorce proceedings with the mediators who are supposed to be representing both sides, who are supposed to be, helping out both here. They're acting like her ex-husband's lawyers in this instance. I thought that was also, interesting, but also disgusting at the same time. The way they're bringing up things like the fact that when she was a child, she sleepwalked when she had stress, when she, before she even got married, she had stress at work and she sought counseling for it. And the kind of demonization of mental illness as well was something else that was touched upon in this movie.
Oh, 100%. I mean, mental health, and just the treatment of it, the public view of it is so far behind what it is, I think, in a lot of other countries, to the point where there just isn't like the programs, there isn't the access to whether it be counseling or therapy or any sort of help. People don't talk about it. You do not talk about, mental health. And a lot of people don't even know, that there might be something kind of going on in their brain that they can get help for.
Right.
Because there's just such a lack of information and awareness. And then if they do realize they want help, there really isn't that much when you, look at a country like America or Western Europe as well, a lot of countries there where it's talked about so much more, and it's so much more open and accepted in the way that like it's nothing is wrong with you. You've just got essentially, something going on in your brain that is not your fault, and you get treatment for it. Just like if you were to like fall down and break your leg, you don't just go home and be like, well, I guess this is it. You go to the hospital and you see a doctor and you get treated for your broken leg. It's the same thing for mental health. And yet here it's just, you don't talk about it.
Yeah. And about the mental health aspect too, I had a student who was who's a therapist, and he had told me a lot about that kind of stuff, and just the degree to which it's not taken seriously, and it's almost looked upon as, if you have a mental health issue, it's something for you to get over. It's not something for you to seek treatment for. If you seek treatment for it, then there's something wrong with you. And Japan, like I always say, Japan is a country of contradictions, because like we were talking about with the childcare thing, they've got all these support facilities for children, but they don't support the parents. It's similar thing with healthcare in a lot of ways, because you've got this, pretty decent public health system, at least in comparison to America, but that support's not there for mental health, really.
Yeah. Mental health, I would say, honestly, is a bigger issue in Japan than I think, a lot of people realize. And when you look at it as an kind of underlying issue, like it almost was in the movie, her mental health was an underlying issue into, kind of the way she parented her daughter, due to previous trauma as a child, and then the PTSD she eventually ended up developing through her job, which is why she ended up seeking counseling and the medication, lended her to be a lot more protective of her daughter, and so fearful of the same thing happening to her that happened to Yoshimi when she was a child. And I can only imagine how true that is for many other parents in general. Parenting is hard.
Yeah.
When you add, in addition to the sleep deprivation and, all the other stresses with trying to raise this child to be the best human you can, then if you've got like anything else on top of that, like therapy would be a great way for dealing with all of this, and yet it's not there.
Yeah.
And it feels like for parents especially, I mean, for everyone, I think everyone could do with a little bit of therapy, but parents especially, that sort of resource should be there in addition to just about everything else we've talked about.
Right. And especially the way that she's treated when she gets help. Like she had a problem, she dealt with it, and they're now using that against her. It's creating it's making it even worse, because you're telling people if you have a problem, you're supposed to ignore it until it gets so serious that it overtakes your life.
Oh, absolutely. They use it as if it's like proof. It's like, aha, like you are an unfit mother because you sought professional help for an issue that you had with your mental health.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, it is really dirty the way the husband uses that against her.
Yeah, it's, yeah, I hate the husband in this movie, and I hate those mediators too. And just like everybody is, well, not working against her as in a conspiracy, but they're just working against her societally in different ways. And you see this even like down to the apartment manager when, she says, there's the leak in the apartment. He's like, oh, well, it's an old building. And there's that whole, and when she calls the real estate guy or the owner or whatever it was, he's like, oh, well, that's not really my department. Then this is something else I've noticed in Japan, is that when you have a collective society like that, there's the diffusion of responsibility sometimes becomes a lack of responsibility completely. And when the lawyer comes in and shows them the other place, and the real estate agent turns to him, he's like, hey, there's a lot of other people in line for your job. This is stuff you're supposed to be taking care of. And then the real estate agent's like, well, the lawyer's like, well, wait a second. She called you too, and you didn't do anything about it either. And there's this continuous passing of the buck.
Oh yeah, you do tend to see that a lot when you have kind of so many people that have their own specific job, but yet it seems like you never get passed to the right person that's supposed to do it. And the person that you would think, well, I mean, you could do this, like the apartment manager. I mean, that really was his job.
Yeah.
But it was so much easier. I think, he was just old and lazy, but she just kind of passed that off on to somebody else that maybe could do it, or, had reasonable access to it, whether or not it was their job. But you do see that in a lot of different businesses. I want to say it's more like just public facilities, like immediately the bank comes to mind, that sort of thing.
The thought that comes to mind immediately is Ikiru, that movie, because it's basically the entire plot of the movie is how everybody keeps passing the buck in the public office.
Not only that, but then you add Japan's love for paperwork. You just don't get anything done.
They always say Japan didn't invent paperwork, but didn't invent bureaucracy. They perfected it.
Yeah, well, anybody who has had to go to the ward office would know that, there's a lot to be done, and yet somehow it doesn't get done.
Yeah. Definitely been there many times. I thought the generational trauma too was something that I didn't really pick up on that so much in previous viewings. Like maybe it just kind of flew past my notice or something, or I wasn't paying that much attention to it, but I picked up on it a lot more this time. Maybe it's because this is the first time I've watched it since having a kid myself. So, you're so worried about how things you've done in your past or how you were treated, how that would affect how you raise your kid. I think that kind of resonated a lot more with me this time around.
Oh, 100%. I think a lot of us, even if we don't think about it, a lot of us carry, to use the word trauma, I don't want to minimize, people who have gone through super specific or super heavy traumas.
Right.
But, we all want to do better for our kids than what we had. And I think when you stop to realize that maybe some of your behaviors or some of the ways that you're parenting are most likely a result of the way you were parented, then you can be a lot more aware of them. I think for Yoshimi, it's hard to tell whether she is actually aware of the fact that, she was left. The movie makes us aware of it, but through the constant comparisons of her as a child versus Mitsuko as a child versus Ikiko. But whether she is 100% aware of it, I'm not sure, but it definitely influences the way she parents her, and it's almost like she's parenting her in a way where she is so afraid to lose her.
Yeah,
Afraid to
yeah.
lose her and afraid to put her through what she went through.
The way I read it is with the comparison scenes is, yeah, you could read it that way. I read it as like her remembering the stuff that had happened to her, and it was kind of like triggering for her, because almost every time you see one of those flashback scenes, it cuts back to a scene of her trying to take some action to prevent the similar thing.
Right. No, I think she definitely remembers it. I just wonder how aware she is of how it affects, her parenting and even the little things that, trying to think of a specific instance, but just in general, how like afraid she is to lose her. But then when she is with Ikuko, making sure she knows how much she loves her, how she will never abandon her. And that sort of thing. I do wonder the degree of awareness that she has.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying now. And yeah, the actress who plays Yoshimi, Hitomi Kuroki, she does a really good job of conveying that constant fear, because she looks like she's on edge the entire movie. I think
she's phenomenal in the movie.
Like just like her constant facial expressions, the way she uses her eyes is really great in this.
Sorry, please go on.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, you definitely get that sense of, honestly, I want to say that sense of drowning, like, which is such a good tie-in, I think, with the theme of the water that they did an amazing job with, because she is so overwhelmed with the divorce and trying to find a job and trying to find a new apartment. And, she wants to leave the apartment once, there's trouble starting, but then her lawyer convinces her not to, because, it might look bad for her in the middle of the divorce. And she's trying to, raise her daughter and spend time with her. And she is just so overwhelmed and so scared of, her worst fear essentially coming true. That, yeah, especially you see with her eyes, and just overall, she has like one or two breakdowns in the movie. You really get that sense of somebody who's just drowning.
Yeah. And Ryo Kano plays Ikuko, who ended up becoming more accomplished actress as she got older. Like last thing I'd seen her more recently in Lesson of the Evil. And she also does a really good job. It's tough when you have these very young kids in these movies, and I thought she did a pretty good job.
Oh yeah, no, she was definitely I thought very convincing in the role of just this innocent child caught up in a divorce and not really knowing what's going on, but knowing, she loves both her parents. But then again, not to give anything away, but that ending scene with her just really, I was like, wow, this girl has acting chops, definitely had me teary-eyed along with her. So yeah, I think the two of them were perfect casting choice.
Yeah, well, that scene is really good. The one scene that jumped out to me too is, after the father picks her up from school, and then and Yoshimi takes Ikuko back, and as they're walking back, Ikuko says, Mom, it's okay, I just want to stay with you. Like that especially when you're rewatching the film in light of the ending, it's all, that scene is all the more heartbreaking.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a few scenes where you can tell like Ikuko just wants to have that kind of normal family life again when she sees that other family who are doing the fireworks.
Right.
And her mom says, oh yeah, we'll do stuff, like that too. And they try to go to the roof to do it. She really just wants that like normal little happy, quiet life with her mom. And, that's what her mom wants too. But unfortunately, a lot of things get in the way.
Yeah. Let's also talk about the ghost in this movie, Mitsuko. One of the interesting things that stuck out to me is how she's kind of like a bridge character between Yoshimi and Ikuko, like the past they've gone through and the current situation, and yeah, she connects to them in a lot of different ways. Basically, is what I'm trying to get at. Like the whole thing, she's this neglected child who was, you know, abandoned by her mother, and you know, just like Yoshimi was in a way, and you know, she longs for that normal happy life. She longs for the mother, just like Ikuko does. And I thought that was a really interesting use of her character.
Yeah, no, I think characterizing her as a bridge is a fabulous way to put it. She represents, I think, both Yoshimi's past in what had, you know, happened to her as a child, and then also Ikiko's, you know, longing to be with her mother while she searches for a mother or parental figure while she haunts the building, which hadn't been too long. It had only been about a year, I think.
Yeah,
she had disappeared, but then she latches onto Yoshimi, and it ends up being this, you know, fight almost with Mitsuko trying to essentially get rid of Ikuko to be able to have Yoshimi all to herself, and then Yoshimi having to make that decision of, you know, abandoning her daughter to save her daughter. With Mitsuko. And then also I find that Mitsuko adds to that oppressive atmosphere that you find a lot in the movie, with all of the rain and her image being the yellow raincoat, and just like the sadness that I feel like not just emanates from her, but emanates from all of the rain scenes that you get. And it's just it's a very, very heavy feeling that I always feel whenever I see her.
Yeah, that just, you just triggered something in me talking about that, and the whole metaphor of drowning, and the fact that in order to the symbolism of that, of how in order to protect Ikuko in the end, to give her the best possible, you know, life she can have, Yoshimi basically has to commit to complete motherhood in a way, and has to allow herself to be swallowed up by all these forces that are working against her. She has to stop fighting them, and there's a sad resignation to that, and it shouldn't be that way, but it is. I think that's a real. I hadn't really thought about that before. You'd kind of, what you were saying kind of triggered that in me.
Yeah, she ends up, you know, having to resign herself and completely commit to being a mother, but not to the child that she wanted,
Right.
You know, to be a mother to. Part of me almost wishes that they could have found a way to like have both children somehow. But of course, you know, that wouldn't work. But she embraces Mitsuko and ends up being a mother to her now forever, you know, in the afterlife. You know, we see her 10 years later and she hasn't aged. She still lives in the apartment and Mitsuko is there. But it's all in effort to save her real daughter.
Right.
You know, so she does end up, I guess, in a way, being a mother forever to two children. Mitsuko in the afterlife, but she's always, you know, kind of aware and just happy that Ikiko is happy, even though, you know, she's growing up now without her and with her father. But yeah, it is that resignation to be the mother that I guess she always wanted to be, but it's not to the daughter she wanted to be.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, being forced to make that choice. And I want to talk a little bit about that ending. So for anyone who, you know, hasn't, so, you know, spoilers for a 25-year-old movie. But I thought it's an interesting ending, touching up on Ikuko 10 years later. And in some ways, I've got mixed feelings about it, because I felt like the ending, it was really interesting to see that to let Ikuko have that reunion scene with Yoshimi, but at the same time, it also felt a little drawn out, I think. And I don't know, I'm really conflicted on it, because I like it in a lot of ways, but it does feel like we're taking away from that dramatic finale by having it in there. What did you think?
I completely get what you're saying with it. I guess if I had to say whether I like it or not, yes or no, I do like it in the sense that for Ikiko, it gives her kind of that closure that she never would have had otherwise. Because I mean, let's face it, how much do you remember clearly from when you were 6? I know I don't remember much at all, even a traumatic event like that. You know, we can kind of see in that scene, she didn't really remember why, you know, her mother was gone all of a sudden, you know, why, you know, she lived with her and she remembered, you know, some parts of that. And then she goes and lives with her father and she never sees her mom. So it does give her that sense of closure that Yoshimi never had, being abandoned. Because in the end, she did end up essentially abandoning her daughter.
Right.
But it gives her that closure that it's not because she was unloved, you know, it's not because her mom didn't want her, but it was all for her sake. And I think just from the sense of Ikiko's emotional point of view, I at least like, you know, knowing that she had that, so she can now move on with her life, knowing that her mom loved her. But also it kind of is a bittersweet scene in that the home is, you know, beautiful and clean, and doesn't have any of that water stain. Like the home was always so like chaotic throughout the movie. But then when she comes back to it, it's super peaceful, it's airy and bright, and you know, her mom is there just like how she remembered her. So to me, it's almost like a very peaceful scene that also gives her closure. So in that sense, I enjoyed it. I think if they had just left it with the ending scene in the elevator, would have been a lot more traumatic, at least for me. It would have been a very heavy ending scene. Not that it would have been bad, but I kind of, just for my own emotional health, appreciate having that ending scene in the apartment.
Well, yeah, and like we were talking about at the beginning, how this doesn't really kind of feel like a horror movie. I think that ending also kind of takes it away from the realm of horror into being much more in the realm of family drama, because you know, a horror movie, it would end on that climactic scene, and it wouldn't really, because a lot of horror movies don't give closure for the main characters, right? It's just kind of like the idea of like the threat is vanquished, but you know, the trauma they've suffered, all of that's still lingering at the end of it. And that's kind of what makes a lot of horror movies so horrifying, is the fact that you know, that sense of dread you have as you're leaving the theater. And I think that the movie doesn't do that it gives closure. I think it definitely, I feel like in a lot of ways this movie is misclassified as horror when it really is more of a family drama that just happens to involve a ghost.
Yeah, no, I'd say that's fair. One thing that I did enjoy was Ikuko as a high school student going back to the apartment building, and you can see that, you know, nobody lives there anymore. It's since abandoned. And then when she goes into that one apartment that used to be hers, you know, it's still beautifully lived in. So I think, especially after, towards the end of that scene when she's leaving it, it does give this sense of just kind of that emptiness to the life that she had there. And it's a stark contrast that I more or less enjoy. That gives me a feeling of, it almost reminds me of The Others, that Nicole Kidman movie. Where I think you're right, it's not so horror as it is emotional family drama, but it's that kind of bleak, empty feeling that still at least reminds me that we are dealing with, you know, the supernatural. We're dealing with loss and death, and a lot of at least horror elements.
There's also another element of sadness to it, and then that when Ikiko's telling Yoshimi about her life now, right? And she's like, you know, oh, well, you know, dad married a younger woman, and they have, you know, they have 2 daughters now. So I've got younger sisters, and they don't really pay much attention to me anymore. And and just like her, some like, even though, she has this reunion, she's, her mother sacrificed for her.
Mhm.
There's still this longing she has for her mother, because even though, her mother gave everything for her, it was at the expense of taking her mother away from her. And that was almost too much of a price to pay for her. I thought that was and it's also another aspect of kind of like the societal forces, I think, that are, when you're pushing all this on women, on mothers in society in the way you are, nobody comes out ahead in the end. Someone eventually loses something.
Yeah, I mean, in effect, it really is just as if he had won the divorce.
Mhm.
It's essentially the same outcome. She would have maybe been able to see her a little bit more in visitation, although while I've never gone through the divorce process myself or anything like that in Japan, or period, I do get this feeling that there tends to be a lot less visitation and a lot less co-parenting
It's almost
when divorce. None.
Yeah,
Right.
It's almost non-existent. It's like, because usually what happens, the most common outcome in a lot of divorce proceedings in Japan is the mother will get sole custody, and the father just kind of like, it's like he never existed. Like,
yeah, he disappears, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's typically, the way it happens. The mother gets the child, and the father just kind of moves on with his life in essence.
Right.
But I would imagine that if it's the other way around and the father gets custody, it still ends up roughly being the same, unless the two people are able to come to their own agreement.
Right. Yeah, that's usually what happens. Is they have to both come to some sort of agreement for co-parenting, because the whole idea of joint custody doesn't really exist here, as far as I know.
Yeah, no. The few cases that I am aware of with divorce and custody, the child even gets taken off. Well, not necessarily taken off, but with the family registry in
Right. Yeah.
Japan, essentially the child and the mother move back to her family's family registry. Family name moves back to her maiden name. Essentially, the father is more or less erased.
Yeah. And if the mother gets remarried, then the child essentially becomes the child of the stepfather. Then.
Yeah, everybody takes on the new last name. It's all moved to the new family registry. So yeah, when divorce happens, it is almost like the other parent dies.
Yeah.
And is removed from the child's life. So in essence, I mean, that is what happened. It was a divorce and it was a death for Yoshimi.
Yeah.
And so it is sad that you end up seeing Ikuko's life becoming exactly what Yoshimi didn't want. And then it's even worse when, you see Ikuko come back and sees her mom, maybe doesn't necessarily realize that they can't be together because she is dead.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all she wants. All she wants is to be back with her mom. And like you said, her family doesn't really worry too much about her. They've got the two younger half sisters and whatnot, but it is sad. It is in essence the same as what it would have been for divorce. And I wonder, how many children of divorce, especially in Japan, can maybe resonate with Ikuko.
Oh yeah, I imagine there's a lot. I imagine there's a lot of that. I mean, I've heard stories about, people I know who have gotten divorced when they had kids. And like, I remember one story I had heard from a friend of mine, his ex-wife had basically said that, she's not your daughter anymore. She's now the daughter of my new husband. And she's like, I can't even imagine what that must feel like.
Oh no. And I hope none of us ever have to, because it sounds like the absolute worst.
Yeah. Also, there's the other interesting thing I thought about the movie, which you probably don't catch at all unless you have some familiarity with Japanese custom, is the symbolism of the number 4, which is where Mitsuko's apartment was. Because so for people who don't know, the 4 in Japanese is shi or yon, and the word shi also means death. So there's this association with 4 as being an unlucky number. So that's kind of like another little hint as to there's something going on when she's on the third floor and this leak is coming from the room above her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is interesting the way that they put in those like tiny little aspects, that it once you see it, it helps you to appreciate, I think, any sort of movie or TV show just that little bit more.
Yeah, yeah. Was there anything else that you think we should mention? Anything that we didn't kind of touch on?
Yeah, I think the main aspects really were the divorce, the mental health. Yeah, I think those were the majority of the main aspects. What were your thoughts about the ending, before the scene with Ikuko 10 years later?
I thought it was powerful, and it's so traumatic because I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was something I wanted to touch on. I'd forgotten about it. But just this is one of the scenes where I thought Rio Kano did a really amazing job, because just in her face, she just conveys that kind of like that mixture of heartbreak and confusion, because she doesn't understand why her mother is going away, right? And I thought that it was heartbreaking watching that ending. And then for her to just and then the elevator door opens, and it's just all the water comes rushing out. I thought it was perfectly done.
Oh yeah, no, I 100% agree. That moment where, she's crying and it just feels so real. Like, what a great child actress to be able to put that much emotion into the scene. And, the doors start closing and she runs out to her calling mama. And there's still that moment where they look at each other through the doors, because it's one of those, old fashioned kind of Japanese apartment building elevators where you have like the two slots of the windows, and they just look at each other before the elevator goes up. And it's just complete sadness and heartbreak in a goodbye that you don't necessarily know if at least Ikiko knows that it is goodbye. She just knows that she's separated from her mom.
Right. Yeah. And
yeah.
Plus, I noticed too that she calls her Ikuko, right? The entire time she's like Ikuchan, Ikuchan, but when she does the mom voice thing, which is like Ikuko. And it's like stay away. And I can't. It's because I see that with my daughter, like when I'm just going to work or something, and she's screaming because she thinks I'm leaving forever, and it's like and in that situation, it is actually happening, and she just doesn't understand why. And she doesn't understand why, because like she says, later, she doesn't really remember much about that time. So this her entire life, like she's gone through these past 10 years, not really knowing what happened to her mother, and and her and her father, being the asshole he is, probably said, "Oh, she ran off on you," or something like that. She abandoned you.
Yeah. But you definitely get this feeling where Ikiko, not understanding what had happened, why her mother left, you never feel this like resentment or anything that she had towards her mother growing up. Like, you abandoned me, you left me. Why would you do that? You must be a horrible person. And I think that must stem from, the memory of what happened. Even though she doesn't remember it clearly, you can still have like those emotional tie-ins to that memory, and knowing that her mother didn't abandon her. Her mother is, out there and loves her. And I think that comes from too that ending of watching her mother essentially give her life to protect her daughter.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why the 10 years later scene has me conflicted, because like the reasons I said, it does feel kind of drawn out, but on the other hand, like you said, it provides that closure, and it also gives that sense that even though her father was more than likely, I think you could say with 95% certainty, he told her that your mother abandoned you. You do get the sense that she has that emotional connection, and that on some level she realizes, my mother would never have abandoned me. And And yeah, it's a really, that aspect really shines through in that final scene, because like you said, there is no resentment. She's just kind of like, she's just happy to see her mom again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it does also speak to, the relationship that they had, but also I think the relationship that a lot of single mothers have with their children.
Right.
It's not always the case that it's a single mother or single parent with one child, but I think especially when it is, that ends up being, your sole support for each other.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a little bit of a different bond, I think, too, especially for those who don't have a lot of other family or siblings or anything like that. And I think this movie really highlights the strong bond that a mother or parent has with their child when it's only the two of them.
Yeah, and which is very common in Japan, because they go where the jobs are, so like it's very easy to be separated from the extended family as a result of that. So yeah, you're right. It does become like the sole support you have is just the parent and the child in that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this movie also kind of highlights just how alone the parent ends up feeling too from that, because the child is still the child and isn't always aware of everything that's going on. They just look to their parent for love and guidance. But for the parent, especially if there's the lack of support from facilities or programs, and then just in general, she had nobody in her corner. Like you could barely even argue the lawyer was in her corner, even though she was paying him. And it was like everybody was just fighting against her.
Yeah.
And then she looks at Ikiko, who is essentially her driving force, and the reason she does everything. It's I think it's a special movie in that sense too, beyond just being a ghost story. It's a movie about what a mother is willing to do out of love for her child.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, I think that's a really good note to end this on. Do you have anything? Please tell people about your YouTube channel.
So my YouTube channel is under S8E3, and it's something I started recently out of just a project that I wanted to give a try. I love creating things. I love Japanese horror, and kind of like I touched on earlier, I noticed a kind of niche pocket where there wasn't a lot out there specifically about Japanese horror that also catered to people that might love horror but get easily scared, might not like the grotesque or the blood that sometimes comes with it, or might not just have access to as much, whether it be the series itself or the series with subtitles. And I thought that was something that I might have a unique perspective on, that I could bring and help increase people's enjoyment and awareness of the genre and of specific movies and TV shows. So that's kind of where I have been focusing on, not so much of the mainstream and the popular, but a lot of the lesser known and the lesser available.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that one of the whole reasons I started this podcast in the first place is because there wasn't really a whole lot of stuff out there about Japanese film unless you're talking about outside of anime, obviously. And so just like that desire to have, that whole thing, you're like, well, I think it was I can't remember what author said, but if there's a book you want to read and it doesn't exist, it's your job to write it. That was kind of like the attitude I took with this show. And it sounds like you did something similar with your YouTube channel. So that's awesome. More voices, talking about these movies and getting people interested in them will hopefully also lead to more distributors putting them back in print.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, more people that have the access, to it within their own countries, being able to watch it and enjoy it, translated will then also increase just the kind of amount of attention that maybe they get from, people making movies and things like that. And more voices heard is always better to the point where, I don't know, who knows, that we might get more of what we want to see and what we enjoy seeing being made.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thanks so much for coming on. It was a fun conversation. We shall have to have you come back on again, talk some more J-horror again in the future.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'd love to be back.
Awesome. All right, so check out her YouTube channel. And as for us, japanonfilm.com, Japan on Film on Twitter and Instagram. Please make sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for watching this episode of Japan on Film. For more of our videos, just hit the subscribe button.